In one of the first iterations of the phrase narcissistic abuse, which I coined in the 1980s, I considered using the phrase ambient abuse, atmospheric abuse. It's an abuse that is diffuse, all-pervasive, all-permeating, and yet cannot be traced to a single source, a single occurrence, a single event, and a single type of misconduct. Ambient. Today I'm going to discuss the environment that the narcissist creates, how this environment is intended to set you up for failure, and your reaction to this set of adverse circumstances, to this dystopian ecosystem. My name is Sam Vaknin. I'm the author of Malignant Self-Love, Narcissism Revisited. I'm also a professor of psychology. The idealization phase, which involves love bombing and so on, this phase actually sets you up for failure because the expectations that are associated with your idealized version in the narcissist's mind, these expectations can never be met. They're not realistic. These expectations are fantastic, counterfactual. They're not grounded. And the expectations of you are constructed in a way that you are very likely to fail the narcissist, to disappoint the narcissist, to let the narcissist down. You can see it in his face, in his body language, in his verbal choices. Idealization is about setting you up for failure. The narcissist tells you that you are drop-dead gorgeous, and then you must maintain this standard. He tells you that you are hyper-intelligent, and all the time he's trying to entrap you with trick questions. He tells you that you are a perfect being, that you are godlike or divine. Of course, no one can measure up to this kind of idealized version of themselves. And so you fail. And failure, your failure, is critical within the shared fantasy, because failure sets the stage. Failure prepares the stage for devaluation. It is your failure that justifies the transition to devaluation and discard. The failure is critical in order to transition to devaluation and the devaluation and discard phases of the shared fantasy. Without failure, it will be very difficult to make sense of this sudden, abrupt about face, of this transition that is unheralded, no harbingers, no antecedents, a transition that comes out of nowhere. 1 minute, you can do no wrong, and you're perfection reified. The next minute, you are human trash. So it is your failure that facilitates this smooth transition from an idealized version to a devalued version and fully accounts for the following discard. But your failure also challenges the narcissist, because remember, the idealization phase involves co-idealization. As the narcissist idealizes you, as you become ideal in the narcissist's mind, as you gain access to your idealized version through the narcissist's gaze, through his eyes, even then, it's all about the narcissist. The narcissist uses the ideal rendition of you, the idealized rendition of you, uses it as the fundament, cornerstone of his or her own idealization. It's like owning a flashy car. Owning a flashy car implies that you are something special. Owning a trophy wife implies that you are irresistible. Teaming up with a hyper-intelligent person testifies, is an evidence to your own genius. So idealizing you is also a part of self-idealization of the narcissist. The narcissist idealizes himself by collecting, appropriating owning and possessing ideal objects, you being one of them. So your failure challenges the narcissist, because the transition from idealization to devaluation theoretically should be mirrored by the transition from self-idealization to self-devaluation. The sequence is this: the narcissist idealizes you, you become an internal object, he owns you, he possesses you, and by possessing you as an ideal object, the narcissist idealizes himself. Then you fail to meet the narcissist's expectations. You fail to conform to your idealized, utterly unrealistic version. Having failed, the narcissist devalues you and discards you, but at the same time, he has to devalue and discard himself. He has made the mistake of idealizing you. His judgment must have been erroneous, or the there were hidden things that he was not aware of, or whatever the case may be. The ideal object that has helped the narcissist to idealize himself has suddenly turned sour, suddenly gone south. Suddenly, this idealized object is no longer ideal. And this is one of the main motivations for the narcissist to re-idealize you and hoover you. Because as long as you remain in the devalued stage, as long as you become a persecutory, devalued internal object, the narcissist cannot idealize himself. This internal devalued object is a part of the narcissist and therefore renders the narcissist imperfect. He needs to regain his perfection by perfecting you, by idealizing or re-idealizing you and hoovering you. All these phases of the shared fantasy take place in a dystopian, total, all-pervasive, all-permeating environment. The narcissist's shared fantasy, by definition, is divorced from reality. It's an ecosystem and a habitat unto themselves. It's a planet far away at the very end of a galaxy. And you are trapped there with a narcissist, in his fantasy, in a narrative, in a script, in a movie, in a theater production, which increasingly more so are divorced from what is real. And so it's a total environment, and in this sense it's very reminiscent of other total environments, such as the army, or a hospital, or a prison. And there is a word to describe your reaction to this totally dystopian, totalitarian, all-inclusive, everything excluded environment. An environment which amounts to a kind of incarceration, an environment which is dreamlike and therefore nightmarish. The reaction to this types of environment is known as solastalgia. Yes, solastalgia. You heard it correctly. It's a fusion of the word solace and the Greek suffix for pain, algia. Solastalgia is a new coinage, a neologism. And some experts are beginning to say that solastalgia can explain the harmful effects of an adverse environment on mental health. Whenever you find yourself trapped, helpless, and hopeless in an ecosystem, in a habitat, in an environment upon which you have no control and which you cannot change in a meaningful way, your mental health is likely to suffer. Solastalgia was coined in 2003 by the Australian philosopher Glenn Albrecht. The term refers to human distress caused by environmental changes to one's home or surrounding, leading to a loss or lack of solace and resulting in feelings of pain or sickness. Albrecht's idea builds off Sigmund Freud's classic 1919 essay, Das Unheimliche. Freud's essay in 1919 argued that anxiety is the outcome of something that he called the unheimliche, an element. It's a kind of unhomelike. The unheimliche is commonly translated into English with the word uncanny. Uncanny. And we have, for example, the uncanny valley reaction, which was first described by a Japanese roboticist in 1970, and I have quite a few videos dedicated to it. So, solastalgia is an uncanny reaction to an environment which is suddenly perceived as alien, estranged, hostile, strange, surrealistic, nightmarish, an environment which fosters helplessness, learned helplessness, which is hopeless, which is all-inclusive, which is boundaried, which is an environment which is limiting and constricting of freedom, of one's identity, of one's personal autonomy and independence, of one's agency, and so on. This kind of highly restrictive, suffocating environment creates an uncanny reaction, an unheimliche Reaktion in Freud's words. Freud argued that seeing familiar objects or environments become unfamiliar was deeply unsettling. It could sometimes challenge one's beliefs about themselves, according to Jacob Lee, chair of the American Psychiatric Association Committee on Climate Change and Mental Health. Now, solastalgia is not like nostalgia. I have a video dedicated to the psychology of nostalgia on this channel. Solastalgia can be relieved. Nostalgia is about the past, and since one cannot effectively revisit the past and one can never ever change the past, nostalgia is unrequited. There's no way to mitigate or ameliorate nostalgia. Solastalgia can be relieved by simply changing the environment, reverting, going back to a more familiar setting, a setting where one regains a sense of mastery and control. Solastalgia arises because home itself may have changed and is no longer recognizable as heimliche, as homely. Now, solastalgia is not a recognized mental health diagnosis or problem, but it's, as Susan Clayton says, a professor and chair of psychology at the College of Worcester. As she said, it is a useful term for recognizing the emotions associated with loss or damage to places that are personally significant. And that is precisely what the narcissist does within the shared fantasy. He isolates you. He divides you away from family and friends and social support networks, from familiar settings and surroundings. He then proceeds to construct meticulously and with attention to detail an environment which is so fantastic, so detached from reality, so unreal, so surrealistic in many ways, that you find yourself within this environment feeling more and more alienated and estranged, wandering through the unfamiliar, through the unheimliche, through the uncanny, feeling increasingly more terrified on the one hand and strangulated on the other. It's a kind of shortness of mental breath or psychological breath. So Clayton says that solastalgia is a source of stress that contributes to mental health problems, just as grief about the loss of a loved one is not a mental health problem, but people can still benefit from help in coping with those emotions. I believe that the narcissist shared fantasy is a self-contained, self-sufficient environment, and that it is so different to anything that is familiar, so different to any previous experience, that it is unsettling and uncanny and nightmarish and surrealistic and therefore create a reaction of acute discomfort and solastalgia. There's been a recent review published online, a scoping review published online in the prestigious academic journal BMJ Mental Health. Researchers from Switzerland, they reviewed the literature, various studies looking at the relationship between solastalgia and mental health issues. They found 80 studies, amazingly. 19 of them were included in the review. And these all in all encompassed 5,000 participants from Australia, Germany, Peru, and the United States. There were 5 quantitative studies included in the analysis, and they revealed positive associations, positive correlations between solastalgia and mental health problems, including depression, anxiety, post-traumatic stress disorder, and somatization. Probably put together, this would amount to what we know as complex trauma. There were 14 qualitative, non-quantitative studies in the review, and they conformed pretty well with the quantitative studies. They provided evidence that solastalgia is, to quote the researchers, the Swiss researchers, solastalgia is a useful construct to understand the emotional responses of persons affected by environmental changes. In general, the findings were very much in line with what we expected, said Susan Fisher, assistant professor of planetary health in the University of St. Gallen and the Institute of Psychology of Zurich. She said people with a lot of place-based feelings of loss were more likely to also have mental health problems. I'm suggesting to expand the scope and meaning and definition of solastalgia, and to apply solastalgia not only to situations where the physical ambience and environment has been altered beyond recognition, but also to situations where the psychosocial environment has been tampered with and has been changed so that it had been rendered unrecognizable and even, I would say, ominously unrecognizable, which is the essence and the core of the experience of the shared fantasy by non-narcissists. They feel trapped. They are regressed and infantilized into the womb, but the womb itself, the womb that is the matrix that is provided by the shared fantasy, is in itself alien, unfamiliar, a little unreal and very surrealistic. And so Fisher and her group found associations, as I said, between changing environments and solastalgia, this sense of discomfort and even pain or hurt. Natural disasters were not highly correlated with solastalgia, but ongoing environmental change, which was perceived as deleterious and destructive, this did create solastalgia. And the authors of the study wrote, this suggests that solastalgia might either be more intense or salient in scenarios of ongoing environmental destruction, as opposed to one-time events, or in scenarios which are clearly human-made and not attributable to any other causes, for example, the weather. This is directly pertinent and applicable to what the narcissist does. The changes in the environment, the newly engendered ecosystem, these changes are ongoing. It is a process of destruction of the old, and the new doesn't make up for it, doesn't compensate for the annihilated old reality. And these are not one-time events or scenarios, they're ongoing, which is the complex element in complex trauma. And finally, it's all man-made. The victim of the narcissist, who is embedded in the shared fantasy, having lost her mind, having absconded with her identity, having become someone completely different, a bit more robotic, the victim of the narcissist feels that it's all man-made. it's not really natural, that the narcissist is responsible pretty directly to what's happening. There is even a misattribution of malice or malevolence or premeditation, previous intent to the narcissist, which is not the case. And so the authors say this notion fits in well with long-standing evidence in trauma research, according to which interpersonal traumas are more likely to cause complex trauma, CPTSD. And they give various examples and so on and so forth. They say that some people might be more vulnerable than others to emotional distress caused by changing environments. Clayton says this. Individuals who feel a stronger sense of connection or attachment to the world have experienced direct impacts of changing environments, for example, climate change, and they feel more vulnerable due to where they live. These people experience greater distress. People who hear more about climate change in the media, older adolescents and young adults, as well as women, may also be more vulnerable. Can we measure solastalgia? Is it measurable? Can it be quantified? Is it a quantitative dimension? There are several scales for measuring solastalgia, surprisingly, including the environmental distress scale, the scale of solastalgia, the brief solastalgia scale, and the 9-item subscale of the EDS. We can use these scales, in my view, to measure the distress, the subjective distress of victims within the shared fantasy of the narcissist, victims who experience narcissistic abuse. So the findings, when it comes to solastalgia, the findings are surprisingly consistent. The scales are therefore validated, and there's great value in assessing solastalgia in people who are subjected to environmental changes which are perceived as minacious, perceived as threatening. Clinicians, as I said, don't recognize formally solastalgia as a mental health condition, but they do use it when they try to give help, or when they try to evaluate people who have been exposed to environmental changes. They use solastalgia as a useful tool, and it's linked, as I said, to grief and indirectly to nostalgia. But I think solastalgia could be developed, further developed, and applied to situations of abusive relationships or toxic relationships, the subjective reaction of stress, distress, anxiety, and dissonance. These reactions in the victims can be grouped together within the conceptual framework of solastalgia. And so many people who find themselves embedded or trapped, more precisely, in such relationships are likely to react with what is easily identifiable as solastalgia. When solastalgia is exclusively applied, for example, to climate change, which is the situation today, I think it is an underestimate of the potential of solastalgia, explanatory potential, and the hermeneutic potential, and the organizing potential of solastalgia. I think there are additional dimensions which have yet to be developed. And solastalgia can be eased. I mentioned earlier that nostalgia cannot be effectively treated, but solastalgia can. There are ways to ease the burden of solastalgia using cognitive behavior therapies mainly. Clayton says that in a more general way, social connections and getting involved in actions to address the environment may help to keep the anxiety from undermining mental health. Solastalgia is known as an eco-emotion because initially it's been linked to climate change and environmental concerns. So we have eco-grief, eco-anxiety, eco-shame, eco-guilt, you name it, eco-everything. But that's very restrictive. And also, in my view, very wrong. Um, Grief is a universal phenomenon. Someone experiencing high levels of grief, according to Fisher, might find that restoring or conserving the environment, including the psychosocial environment, is helpful in regulating these emotions. So I wanted to introduce this idea into the discourse and the narrative of narcissistic abuse. I think it could be a very productive and fertile ground which could yield treatment modalities later on. We need to accept that the narcissist creates a paracosm, an alternative reality, a virtual universe, and then hijacks the victim and transports the victim or teleports the victim into this alternative reality, into this other universe. And this abrupt dislocation is accompanied by repeated exposure to the less familiar, more alienating, more estranging, more nightmarish, and more surrealistic dimensions and aspects of this new unrecognizable planet or universe. And the victim tries to acclimate herself, to habituate, to somehow survive in this newfound environment. And this generates a lot of anxiety and distress. And because she recognizes that the planet is not real, that it is an extension or projection of the narcissist's mind, the victim also develops subjective distress, coupled, I think, with aggression and rage and anger and grief, negative affects. Negative affectivity is a critical feature of solastalgia that hasn't been studied yet. And I think once solastalgia comes to characterize or encapsulate the reaction to this alien planet of narcissistic abuse, the shared fantasy far away in the remotest reaches of the galaxy of the human mind, once solastalgia is applied rigorously, I think it would give us a rich yield of ways to help victims of narcissistic abuse by reintroducing them into familiar, comforting, homely reality, the reality they have left behind, their identity included, from the unheimliche, the uncanny, to the heimliche, the homely and the domestic and the soothing